we can't have the sense data be conceptually organized, or else it's not real objectivity and we fail to begin with. What Sellars rejects this as is what he calls, as I said, the myth of the given. It's actually interesting that he keeps it a capital G because he says there are other, that he means given as things that are given to us non-conceptually. And that's what the capital G represents, as opposed to things that are given, like, certain propositions are just kind of true, like things fall when you drop them, right? That's a little lowercase g given. But these big G givens are absolutely non-conceptual things that we are somehow in contact with and can intellectualize later, basically. So that's what the big G is why it's a big instead of a little one. Why is it a myth? Well, what Sellars is saying, what his critique of sense data theorists is that, okay, so there are these non-conceptual things, these objective things that are not subjective. But somehow we have a faculty that can take non-conceptual things and organize them in such a way that we get a great conceptual framework. We can build science on it, we can build reason on it, we can do all of these things. But Sellars notices the major flaw. How are things that are completely non-conceptual, they're completely non-conceptual, non-organized in any way, there's no differentiating features between them at all. How can you make judgments about them such that you can organize them in a way? Like, what would you organize them by? By what? By our criteria. They're all non-conceptual. And the things that we organize things by are concepts, right? We organize with concepts. So Sellars is very suspicious of this idea. And really, his argument is, the essay is quite long and pretty poorly written. But, but it's really a great fundamental essay and in the history of philosophy, and it really represents kind of the final straw in empiricism, philosophical life, at least in the extreme empiricism. Let's move forward. Sellars was one of the major figures that I worked on. Another one was John McDowell, who now works at Pittsburgh, is still alive. But there are three major figures now, Richard Rorty, John McDowell, and Robert Brandon. Rorty has recently passed away. Rorty discusses, he's in this tradition, the Sellarsian tradition, of discussing the social and cultural aspects of our experiences and our knowledge. So he's really into explaining things like, let's see if we can give a good example. Why does everyone stop at red lights? It's kind of like a social rule. It's not really there's nothing about a red light that means stop in any objective sense, right? It's just that, we kind of all get together and say, oh, we're going to stop at red lights so we don't get in car accidents, right? McDowell and Brandon are also in a similar history, a similar tradition with Sellars. McDowell I'll come to in a second. Brandon takes a really scientific causal approach to understanding these questions. He wants to know he wants to hang on to science as we have it, theories of perception, psychology, physics, of course, and he wants to use these ideas to explain how photons hitting the eye are going to cause concepts in the mind, and how really what's the relationship between that, such that we can have objectivity. Brandon's conclusion, and actually McDowell's as well, and Rorty's too, is this idea of intersubjectivity. So let's get into that. McDowell and intersubjectivity. What is intersubjectivity? Well, intersubjectivity is this idea that we have, this is kind of goes back to Rorty too. There are many minds in a community. We're all in an English-speaking, American community, and also now we're more of a global world community, where we all communicate with each other in language. But the interesting thing is that the rules of the language and kind of the usage of the language defines how we interact and speak with each other. The reason I can't come up here and say, the car is showing you this is because we have decided that is indeed not a car. It's a board, right? So they're talking about how we determine use and meaning in terms of the intersubjective relation. So it's between subjects. That's basically what they're going with intersubjectivity. What they're doing here with this is they're redefining. What they want to do is redefine the notion of objectivity out of the modern sense of objectivity, as we have talked about it, into intersubjectivity. They want to take it away from there are objects in the world outside of mind, outside of subjectivity, and these objects are also knowable by subjects. Instead, they want to say there are objects in the world, but they're not really outside mind. They're not, and it doesn't have to be like a freaky, new age conclusion that we're all minded together and everything. It can be, and there are people that do that, but it doesn't have to be. And McDowell and the other two actually do not think that. Their conclusion is more that we have just a conceptual understanding of the world, such that the only way we can define objectivity is through these inner subjective conditions. There is no out there by which you can, kind of match up and say 1-to-1, this is right. All you have are inner subjective conditions of knowledge and truth. And this is where my project is. Why is it science and epistemology? Well, I think that what the important things that Sellars and McDowell are getting at are this idea that inner subjectivity is really the only useful definition of truth and knowledge and objectivity. What the myth of the given, and McDowell talks about this too, really represents this idea that, okay, so epistemology is the science of knowledge, it's the given account of knowledge at the statement. But he said, the modern view says, okay, here's mind and world, they're separate from each other in some way. Then they define knowledge saying, okay, knowledge is when the mind and the world are 1-to-1, they coincide. But wait a second, we've just hypothesized that mind and world are separate. There's a fundamental problem here. How are you going to get them back together? You've already defined them in such a way that you can't. It's just by the rules of the game. You've said they're separate, you can't get them back together. That's basically what the myth of the given is about. And so what you have is modern epistemology chasing its tail around, never getting anywhere. What Sellars and McDowell and what I think is that instead, you don't have to split between the mind and the world. And this goes back to what Kant's fundamental insight is about experience, is that to even have the concept of the world, to have the idea of the world, to have experiences at all, presupposes conceptual apparatus and presupposes a contact with concepts in the world. Because if there are no concepts in the world, if there is no conceptuality in the world, you don't have experiences. Because we've already decided that experiences are always already conceptual. There's already conceptuality there. So what I want to do is move into a more rich understanding of science that can step away from Enlightenment science. So why is this really not a problem for scientists today? Well, because it took philosophers 200 years to kind of figure out something was amiss, right? And by that time, science stopped listening to philosophy for probably good reasons. So that's why you kind of still have this. That's why it's not really, no one really sees it as a problem in like the scientific community, which is fine because functionally everything works great. Philosophically, though, there's an issue. You have to figure out a way to talk about knowledge and talk about justification for knowledge, especially scientific knowledge, in such a way that doesn't appeal to the myth of the given or technically foundationalism. That you don't appeal to this idea of foundationalism, something that you can grab onto that is the real world, not subjective. Because if you do that, you've made the mistake of the myth of the given. So what my account attempts to do, is to try to give an account of science and scientific knowledge and justification in the context of perception as conceptual, experience as conceptual, that we can have an inner subjective view of objectivity that maintains the richness and really, really powerful explanatory nature that science, I think, has. I think that I don't want to, there are some people that want to give up on contemporary science and say, it's not objective in the sense they think that it is. And they're probably right. Science really isn't objective in the way that many scientists think that it is. But that's okay, because it works really well. and it gives us a lot of really cool things, like bridges, roads, overhead projectors. So we have to give an account as to why this works, because we see that it does. But the account as to why it works will not be the modern philosophical account. It will not be the account that Enlightenment science took up. It has to be a different account that is sensitive to Sellars' criticisms of the ideas. So I would like to thank my advisor, Patrick Murray, and of course the dean and all the deans of the college, and of course the honors program for providing me the opportunity to pursue my research. I had a great time doing it this summer, so I learned quite a bit, so thank you.